My name is Hannah Surratt. I'm in Block 1 and I did my How It's Made project on the production, distribution, and consumption of apples. My guiding questions are: what are the stages in the life cycle of an apple? Who or what pollinates an apple blossom? How are apples produced? How does the product reach its consumers? And how are apples transported? My academic vocabulary is produced, which means made or manufactured; distributed, meaning given or dealt out; consumed, meaning taken or bought; fresh apple, meaning an apple that is eaten whole, not made into something else, such as apple cider or applesauce; apple blossom, which is the flower that apples come from; pollination, which is the transfer of pollen from one flower to another; grafting is using a shoot of a twig from an apple tree to grow others like it; trellises is a wooden frame; penetrometer is an instrument used to determine the pressure required to penetrate an apple; the supply means to make available or provide; and demand is the want or need for a good or service. The life cycle of an apple. Apples begin as a flower called an apple blossom. These flowers are then pollinated by typically honey bees or bumblebees, but sometimes the wind can help pollinate flowers. The flower then begins to, or the apple then begins to grow from the stem of the flower, and eventually the apple gets heavy and drops, and so it kind of turns over, and then the petals fall off and the apple drops, and the stem of the apple is where the flower stem used to be. So the growing process of apples on an apple orchard, I learned through my research that the seeds from an apple don't always produce that same variety of apple when they're planted. So apple farmers will graft apple trees, which means they peel off part of the twig and then they plant that, and that is called grafting or budding, and that's used to make the same kind of tree so that they'll produce the same kind of apples. New apple orchards are planted in V-shaped wooden frames to help with growth. This kind of helps with the way the wind hits them and the way the sunlight will hit the apples. The trees are then tested and maintained throughout the year, so different things such as the soil are tested, and then different like fertilizers will needed to be added and things like that. 25 to 50% of the limbs of the tree end up being removed each year, and again, this has to do with things like sunlight hitting the apples and just cutting away that dead overgrowth of the tree. The apples are ready to be picked after they've been sampled using the penetrometer, which was one of our vocab words. This measures kind of the crispness of the apple, so this is a machine that punctures both two sides of an apple, and it measures the amount of weight it would take to penetrate the apple, and you want it to be about 14 pounds, and that means it's crisp enough to eat but not too crisp that you can't bite into. A full-grown apple tree can produce 20 bushels, or about 20 crates of apples each year. Apples are then put into the cold storage refrigerator, where they can be kept for about 4 to 6 months after being picked before they're distributed. There are a lot of costs associated with producing apples and owning an apple orchard. There's a lot of startup cost, including buying the apple orchard, and all of the labor that it takes. And there's a lot of hidden costs. You don't think about how many different types of laborers you need on an apple orchard, or all of the pesticides and fertilizers and things like that that are going to grow into it, as well as, or go into producing apples, as well as the different coolers and fans, and like we talked about, those wooden frames. There's all kinds of hidden costs and startup costs associated. An apple tree can begin to bear fruit in the first or after 3 years, but it doesn't really reach its full growth until the 6th or 7th year, and it typically takes a commercial apple orchard about 10 years to reach its full production. and the investor begin to profit. So following China, the United States is the world's second largest producer of apples. Apples are commercially grown in 32 U.S. states. Washington produces the most apples, and North Carolina produces the seventh largest amount of apples in the United States. On average, 4 million bushels of apples are produced in North Carolina each year. The peak harvest season for North Carolina is from August to October, but other states' season lasts a little bit longer, typically from about July to November. And North Carolina produces 4 types of apples: the Red Delicious, the Golden Delicious, the Rome Beauty, and Galas. So one of our guiding questions were, how does the product reach its consumers and how are apples transported? So apples are grown by the grower, like we talked about, typically at an apple orchard, and there they are kept and stored. They go through a process where they're all hand picked, and then they're put in crates and they're stored. Then they go through a process before they go into storage where they are like run through a machine that checks for bruising and things like that. Then they're stored. Then once they're ready to be distributed, they go through that machine again and are checked and stickered. Then they go to a shipper who takes them to a distribution center, and then they go to the retailer. So now we're going to talk about the consumption of apples. Apples are the most popular fruit grown in the United States. Gala apples are the most purchased apple in the United States. On average, Americans eat about 18.5 to about 18.5 apples per year. And we actually use about 44 pounds of apples each year, each household. And this doesn't mean just eating fresh apples. This can be with things like apple cider, applesauce, apple butter, apple pies, and fresh apples. 60% of North Carolina's apples are marketed through the processing industry, such as applesauce, juice, pie, all those things I just talked about. And only 40% of North Carolina's apples are marketed fresh, which means just eaten as is and not made into something else. And here we have my citations. Thank you.